Welcome back to the Political Marketing Podcast with me, Benedict Pringle. This is the podcast that seeks to understand how election candidates, political parties and campaigning organisations win hearts, minds and votes. My guest today is Luke Tryl, the UK Director of More in Common. Luke has had a fascinating career across government, politics and the third sector. Amongst other roles, he served as a special advisor to Nicky Morgan at the Department for Education and led strategy at Ofsted. He's also a frequent media commentator and sense talker on politics and current affairs. So if you're wondering, is it that Luke off the telly? Yes, it is. Welcome to the show, Luke.
Thank you so much for having me.
For those who don't know it, More in Common is an international research organisation that does polling and analysis to understand what unites and divides people and how to strengthen democracy against polarisation. Polarisation is a topic we've covered a fair bit on this podcast already, so it sort of seems to be bang on brief. And today we're going to focus on a fascinating study that More in Common published in July called Shattered Britain. And what it's a massive study. I think 20,000 people interviewed or polled for it. And what I loved about it was that it proposed a new framework for understanding the voter segments that are shaping the current electoral landscape, which I think it's a really novel approach to it. And I think you, the listeners, will really enjoy getting deep into it. Before we get into the segmentation, we need to understand what underpins it. And it'd be interesting to just get a bit of background, Luke. What sort of prompted More in Common to commission Shattered Britain?
Yeah, so thank you again for having me on. More in Common, as you mentioned, is an international organisation. And as you say, we spend a lot of our time trying to get under the skin of not just what people think about different issues, but why they think it. And the basis for that, actually, in all of the countries we work in, is our segmentation model. And this is a way of, I'm sure your audience will be used to segmentations, but if in case any of them aren't, of sort of dividing up the public into different groups or tribes or segments, as we call them, to understand how those different groups react to different ideas, policies and approaches. And what is unique about our segmentation is that it isn't based on demographics at all. Nor is it based on partisan political beliefs. It's entirely rooted in social psychology and values. So it tries to go a bit more upstream. So it incorporates things like Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, things around need for chaos, individual agency, some of Karen Stenner's work on authoritarianism as well, to produce the segmentation. And we originally produced this segmentation in 2020, but the field work was being done around February 2020, and as we know, the world has shifted significantly since that point, not least the full impact of the pandemic, but also the sort of, I think in 2020 at that point, lots of us were thinking, have we come to the period of calm following the Brexit rows in particular? Turned out that wasn't to be the case. And we labelled that report Britain's choice. Which way is Britain going to turn in this new era? Now, Britons were slightly denied that choice by the advent of the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, the war in Ukraine. One of the feelings that comes across in the report very strongly is this sense of a country that's been buffeted by forces beyond its control. So we felt that 5 years on from that study, after a general election, was the right time to refresh it. We probably would have left it longer in ordinary segments, and in other countries, the segmentations have run for longer. But that specific timing meant we felt it was the right time to have a look at the new contours of Britain. And as we'll, I'm sure, go on to talk about, the sort of main elements of that report are: what is shaping the public mood? So what are the sort of drivers of the national mood? And we called it Shattered Britain for a number of reasons. One, because if you ask Britons to describe the UK in a word, the most common word they use is broken. So there is that element. But there's also that very British meaning of shattered, which is tired, exhausted. So we look at the drivers. We then look at the new and emerging fault lines. And then we look at how that interplays with the segments, and in particular politics and their attitudes to policy. So that's the kind of structure and genesis of the report. And our kind of hope, as we say, as I wrote in the foreword to the report, is that it provides somewhat of, we don't pretend to be policy experts, but understanding the sort of contours and the segments hopefully provides a roadmap for those people whose job it is to get us out of the current malaise.
I also liked the idea of a segmentation being titled Shattered, because and there is 7 segments, isn't there, which we will get onto. So I enjoyed that sort of potentially third geeky meaning of it. And it's interesting, you know, shattered, Britain is broken. I think we hear a lot of that. How markedly is that change from 5 years ago? And I guess, you know, personally, I sort of feel like, you know, things started to go very badly at the financial crisis and sort of haven't ever gotten much better. Do the public go that far back, or is this sense of shatteredness a more recent thing, let's say going back to 2020?
So look, I think it's fair to say that the public mood has been gloomy for some time. I think the difference between now and 2020 is the question of, is there light at the end of the tunnel? And I think in 2020, when we did this, people were like, gosh, things have been difficult for too long. They've been hard, but are we getting out of it? We've sort of resolved Brexit. We've got this new government come in, which has promised things around levelling up, which, had big appeal to lots of the country, big majority. Will they start getting things done? I think the difference today is that people are less confident that light at the end of the tunnel is there. And that, you know, in some ways sits on top of the general feeling of things aren't working at the moment, this sense that we can't see a way out of it. Again, in the forward, I sort of, I think the closest historical parallel that we could find looking at the public mood is the sort of 1970s, which were another era of perma-crisis for the country. The difference, of course, between the 70s and today is the information world. So, we're basically, as I said before, it's like we're in the 70s, but with social media and everyone able to pick their own truths to some degree, which might make charting a path out harder.
And you talk about the 4 key drivers behind this sense that Britain is shattered. So you talk about declining trust in politicians and institutions, exhaustion with politics, a rising threat perception, a sense of lack of control. Some of these things might go away. For example, that exhaustion with politics seemed to die down a bit, as you say, post-Brexit and US elect Biden. But other things like this lack of control or declining trust, they to me seem things like they are baked in now. Does that mean that the public are likely to feel shattered for a considerable amount of time? This is not a blip.
Yeah, I mean, it is an open question. So, I mean, if you look at those drivers, I think the one we're most used to talking about is the trust one. And there is always a little bit of but wasn't it always so? We've had healthy disdain for politicians for a while. I think the difference on trust is the extent to which it has spread to other institutions as well, particularly institutions which, traditionally commanded reasonably high levels of trust. So the police is one where you see more divides than you did in the past. I should say there are some positives on trust. So people are still, overwhelmingly likely to trust their neighbour and to trust scientists. Actually, that's quite an important one because it's quite unique in the UK that we don't have that polarization on science. So you've got the trust one, but then I almost think the other three are worth spending more time looking at because, they're somewhat more novel. Rising threat perception, this sense that since we last ran the study, people are 10 points more likely to say that the world is becoming a more dangerous place, and it was already a high base up in the 70s. Maybe no surprise, when we talk to people in focus groups, people will say, I don't know what that madman in the Kremlin's going to do next. I don't know what that guy in the White House is going to do next. Conflict in the Middle East, and also perceptions in the UK of crime. So that threat perception is a really strong predictor of people's political views as well. People who think the world is becoming more dangerous are more migration skeptic, more tough on law and order issues, but also interestingly, climate change is an interesting one because it kind of intersects both ways in the sense that people with high threat perception actually tend to be particularly worried about climate impacts and therefore want to tackle climate change. Although on the other hand, some of them then worry about the threat from transition because, the UK doesn't have a particularly good history of managing economic transitions in a way which brings everyone with them. So you've got those two. And then the other two, so exhaustion. I mean, this is, both exhaustion with, the cost of living most directly, that life is just too hard for people. I spoke to I speak to people all the time who just describe the impact that is having on their lives. And when we went to Runcorn after that by-election in that formerly safe Labour seat that Reform won, and spoke to a woman there who sort of summed up the mood. And, she said, I'm in my late 50s. I thought I'd be winding down. I'm still doing shift work. I just feel like I'm not living. I'm just surviving. And that sort of life is just too hard. It's too hard to get a GP appointment. It's too hard to drive around, part of it. But also exhaustion with politics, the politics of chaos. And I think particularly since the election, there was a bit of there was a hope that Keir Starmer's promise of a politics that treads a bit more lightly on our lives would become a reality for people. That doesn't seem to have happened. So you've got this personal exhaustion and political exhaustion. And then that goes into what I think is the most important of the drivers, which is agency or control. And I know you might disagree with me on this, but I think "Take Back Control" is one of the most successful political slogans.
Brilliant.
And it's simple, but also it speaks to that very human desire, right? I want to be in control of my life, and too many people don't for that. They think the next energy bill could knock them over the edge. They don't think government is in control. It can't sort out the NHS, it can't control the border, and internationally things feel out of control as well. So people are really craving control. And, we'll go on to talk, I think, about the politics of this in more depth, but, we are seeing a reward not just in the UK, but around the world for politicians who offer greater levels of control. And if that doesn't shift, yes, that could become a permanent feature.
And just sort of, I could imagine, number 10 or number 11 Downing Street looking at the list of these drivers and go, yeah, that's all well and good, but, a nice bit of economic growth will sort them all out. Is it definitely deeper than that? Is it not just, because they, as you say, there are some quite deep things there in those four drivers. How much of it is, if we all started making a bit more money and the economy was going in the right direction, they would all come good, do you think?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any doubt that if people feel better off, it will help to alleviate some of those. And I would put it almost slightly differently. I think what underpins all four of them is the sense that government isn't doing its job. People feel the government isn't doing its job to protect people and make their lives easy, right? And if government starts to do that, I think lots of that will fade away. But I guess what you've got is you're starting from a position where, I've talked about this before, the public in the UK basically think, 2016 we vote for change, 2017 Corbyn surge is a vote for change, 2019 vote for change, 2024 vote for change, and yet they never get the change. So there's a danger that the sort of cynicism becomes baked in to some degree amongst the public, and I think that becomes then much harder to get out of. Add to that, and we could go on to talk a bit about the fault lines, but one of them is the growing preference for some groups to say, I like to find my own truth and seek out my own truth. That might mean even if you solve all of these problems, people don't necessarily believe it, right? And they don't see it. And I think, one of the clearest examples of that is I ran a focus group in Wandsworth a couple of weeks ago now, and I showed them, we talked about crime, cost of living, and people in the group were saying it's getting worse, and I showed them some of the stats. I showed them the real wage growth over the past year compared to inflation. People were like, well, it doesn't feel like that compared to my shop, I showed them the declining crime stat. Again, people didn't recognize it. So there's something deeper than just it's working a bit better.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense to me. It's that perception of things, isn't it? 100%. So let's go on to the fault lines, because again, I really enjoyed these. And as you said earlier, your segmentation doesn't do things on the basis of the old left-right spectrum, and doesn't sort of consider ideology. It's about these 8 fault lines. I'll just read them through, and then it'd be great to dig into a couple of them. So the fault lines are preserve the institutions versus burn them down, roll the dice versus play it safe, mainstream media versus alternative narrative, rise in conspiracy thinking versus trust in experts, diversity versus national identity, freedom of speech versus protection from hate speech, and simple fixes versus complex problems, and in control of life versus no control. And it's so interesting when you read through all those 8, it paints a really clear picture of just different types of people. And what's great about it is you can't sort of, if I'm thinking about, a Christmas dining table and you've got your whole extended family around, you couldn't split it down the middle. People don't sit all on one side or all on the other. And I think that's really interesting about them. So you just before we went through those 8, you were talking a little bit about this roll the dice versus play it safe. I wonder if you could sort of dig into that one a little bit, because as you say, that the electorate have been thinking they've been voting for change over the last few cycles, and feel like they haven't got it. How strong is that roll the dice vibe out there?
Well, look, so the truth is that instinctively, most Brits are quite risk averse, right?
Yeah.
Most people like to play things safe. So I guess one of the, it's not just electoral competition, but let's look at that. One of the emerging axes of electoral competition is a kind of a sort of seesaw of scale of people's risk aversion come next versus the current status quo is so bad that even the risk must be worth it, because how much worse can it be? And what we find is asking a question around what describes the way you feel. So whether do you think sensible people avoid dangerous activities, or do you say that I like to do things which are a little frightening, actually correlates to where you sort of sit on that seesaw, how much uncertainty and risk you're willing to tolerate from what might come from something untested, a bit more bombastic, a bit different, versus the sense of, I don't really like the status quo, but we've got to be careful not to throw it out, throw the baby out with the bathwater. So you've basically got around 3 in 10 who like to do things that, are a bit more, they are more risk inclined there. And then you've got the remainder of the public who are, still more risk averse, but it becomes a balance of risks. It's the people who are saying, yeah, I am risk averse, but it can't be more risky than what comes. And that ties closely, although not exactly, with the first fault line, which is burn it all down versus preserve our institutions.
Yeah.
So this sense of, the question is not, is Britain on the right or the wrong track when 80% of people say wrong track, right? The question is, how do we get back on the right track? And you have 3 in 5 who say our political institutions are worth preserving and improving. And then you've got 2 in 5, a big chunk, who say, and this is literally the wording that we use when I think about our political and social institutions, I cannot help thinking just let them burn. And that is
staggering. 2 in 5.
And that anti-system, that axis of pro and anti-system, if you think about politics, you basically got Tories pro-system right, Labour and the Lib Dems pro-system left, and then you've got, Reform absolutely dominating on the anti-system right, but also your party and the Greens under Polanski, anti-system left. So it's a really important, I think, emerging axis of competition.
And one of the other ones I thought was interesting, and you touched on it a little bit already, is the mainstream media versus the alternative narrative one. And I guess it seems to me that if you're someone who believes in the alternative narrative, then there's a few others that you're more likely to sort of, if you go through that door, you're gonna keep going. Is that right? As some of the some of the more important than others in driving other behavior or other perceptions.
Yeah, and look, this is a really important one, because if you are by disposition, and I think the pandemic played an outsized role in shaping people's outlook here. Most of these values are pretty stable over time, but I think, particularly on this one, the pandemic just, changed it for lots of people because, they spent more time on their own. They were more subjected to alternative narratives. If you do not have that kind of mainstream anchoring, which I'm not always, sometimes when I'm talking about this, it sounds like I'm doing a defense of the mainstream. Clearly it has its own problems, but if you are more attracted to alternative narratives, you are also probably more likely to see the attraction of alternative ways of running the country, might be more attracted to sort of strongman leadership. And certainly when it comes to some of the questions on identity and free speech, people who prefer alternative narratives tend to have some of the more outlier views there as well. So it's a really interesting one. And it's not just mainstream versus alternative. It's also, one of the things we asked about was professionally produced reports versus raw footage. And you've got, 40% of people want to see raw footage live. It appeals to them. So yeah, this is kind of self-reinforcing. And, I sum it up. I've spoken about this before, but I think the fault line that follows this is around conspiracy thinking. And I think it's not only are more people seeking out alternative media, which might in some cases reinforce conspiracy thinking, we've also lost what I call come off it moments. And so, it was in Dudley, spoke to a guy who said, he was a crane driver, and he said, we used to all eat together on construction sites before the pandemic. Now, even 5 years after, we all sit in our cars. And what that means is you're being you sit on your phone, basically. And so, whereas before, let's pick a relatively benign conspiracy theory, the moon landings were faked. You would go, you'd sit with, your mates or your colleagues, and you say, I think this, and they'd say, come off it. That doesn't happen anymore. Rather than saying, come off it, you, in your phone, put moon landings fake and get subjected to a load of other people who think the same thing. So it becomes much more, it's not just the, algorithms, it's the loss of the other bit, the people being like, come on, mate.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And do you do things like, the old school drivers, or what are perceived to be the drivers of sort of political identity and decision making, like class and education and income? Does that mean that you are more likely to be on one side of these sort of fault lines than the other? Presumably, it does play into it.
Yeah. No.
somewhat.
And so whilst demographics don't go into the segmentation, they certainly come out of it at the other
Right.
end. And it won't surprise you to know that if those people who are, most financially precarious, for instance, are more attracted to the anti-system side of the spectrum, are more likely to seek out alternative narrative because, the status quo isn't working for them. So that's very definitely one. Again, not to get too deep on it, but I suppose lots of this is quite deep. In a social contract which favours a graduate class, many more graduates are on the pro-system, mainstream, benefits of diversity side of the spectrum than those who have, less formal education or technical education.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so let's go on to the segment. So we've done the drivers, we've done the sort of the divisions, and that brings us to the segment. So if I could put it in a very basic way, my sort of lay understanding of it, it's all maybe slightly more. You've asked all those dividing questions, which side are you on, and basically, depending on what you've answered, they've sort of clustered into 7 broad groups who answer the questions in a similar way. Is that a good understanding of?
Yeah, I think that's So we use cluster analysis in order to create the segments, and then we have a series of what we call golden questions, which are the most predictive of those questions, which people, if you'd like to take the quiz, listeners, it is on our website to find out which one you are in. But the golden questions then use an algorithm to sort people into the 7 segments.
And would you mind giving us a quick run through the 7 segments?
I will give you a quick count through. To start with progressive activists, because it's often the easiest to explain, this is a group who, if you look at lots of those questions, are particularly motivated by social justice. That is the core driver of their identity. They're very politically engaged, quite globally, which is quite interesting, whereas some of the other groups think quite locally. Form the backbone of, campaigning NGOs, that lean very left, but can be outliers, in fact, indeed are outliers from the other segments particularly on questions around identity. Actually, there's a lot of common ground on the economy, but, they're the only group, and given we're all talking about flags at the moment, I'll use this example. They're the only group who, for instance, say they feel bad when they say, or more likely to feel bad than good when they see the St. George's Cross flag. So that's one group. Incrementalist left actually share a lot of the values of progressive activists, but I guess hold them a bit more lightly and see lots of value in the status quo. For them, it is a matter of helping our institutions get better. And they're also much more, I guess, politics averse. This is a group that really do want politics that treads more lightly, and they see it as a good thing if they're not having to pay attention to politics. Established liberals, and sorry to use a sort of political term here, but I think it does just capture them, is basically Cameronite conservatives, as we think of them. They are prosperous, liberal on social issues, the only part of Boris Johnson's 2019 coalition that voted Remain, value expertise. I think the system works. Skeptical scrollers, this is the newest group in this segmentation and massively shaped by the pandemic, but a group that actually holds quite heterodox political views that, sort of first glance, you might not understand how they all come together. They are by far the most likely to, want to find their own truth. Younger tend to think the social contract hasn't worked, particularly around things like housing. Rooted patriots. This has, long been the most important group in our politics, basically, the group that gives Boris Johnson his landslide and then undoes it in 2024. Very place-based compared to the progressive activists who are very global, tend to feel overlooked or let down by by politicians and those in power as well. Traditional conservatives, that sort of does what it says on the tin, proud to be British, quite nostalgic, but crucially, and this is quite important for where they go next, quite pro-institution, And then finally, another sort of quite new group, dissenting disruptors. This is a group very unhappy with the status quo, very unhappy with issues around diversity, very pro free speech in quite an American way that's quite unusual for Britain. And if rooted patriots feel overlooked by elites, dissenting disruptors feel actively disparaged by them.
Right. And so that is fascinating. And again, they paint a really clear picture. So I think they're really good segments in that sense. Let's get onto the sort of the not, I don't want to say the tactical, but like of those 7 segments, could you help make sense of what happened in the 24 election? And if you were to try and explain that result, potentially using some of the segments, how might you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't mind, I might just take a quick step back to 2019, actually, because I think that helps us even more. And basically what you get is the absolute dominance of Boris Johnson across these segments. So he wins, as you might imagine, traditional conservatives, rooted patriots, the dissenting disruptors who often don't vote because they don't like to go come out and vote for him. Established liberals don't really like the Brexit rhetoric, but basically hold their nose because they're scared of Jeremy Corbyn, to be frank, and vote for him. And even the incrementalist left sort of split much more than normal because they, again, don't particularly like Boris Johnson. Lots of them stay at home, but they don't like Corbyn either. And so, Conservatives get one of their better results with that group, not winning them, but coming close. And progressive activists basically are the base of, the Labour Party in that election. Like Jeremy Corbyn immensely benefits from the progressive activist support, but they are only 12%. And I should have said the segments are not equally sized, so some maximum others. Let's fast forward to 4, and this is where you see the shift. This is where you really see, I think, what's being known as Labour's broad but shallow coalition emerge. Firstly, the rooted patriots, they get 17% in 2019. They get that up to 29% in the election. So a bit of a recovery, but, perhaps not as much as they might have hoped. Incrementalist left, they rise get quite a clear victory, 46% to the Tories, 16% with that group. Interestingly, English liberals, a big jump. This is a group who are typically the bastion of the Conservatives, but from 19 to 31, the Tories down to 35 with that group. And the sceptical scrollers are very low turnout, but again, Labour gets 40% to the Tories 21%. And then of the other segment, which goes for the Labour Party, the interesting thing is the progressive activists, Labour actually loses vote share there. They go from 57% to 49% because this group don't like Keir Starmer's brand of leftism compared to Jeremy Corbyn's. They want the full fat version. You see big green risers with that group. And then the two most sort of, I shouldn't use right, having spent the whole time talking about the virtues of other axes, but the two more traditionally conservative segments, one called traditional conservatives, you get, traditional conservatives, Tories go from getting 85% to 61% with this group. So it's a big drop. They are only 8% of the smallest of the segments. And then the dissenting disruptors, this is actually a group that Reform wins. So Boris Johnson cleans up with dissenting disruptors, 57%, Reform on 36%. So what's the story here? The story is basically Conservatives quite literally reduced to their core. They only narrowly pull off a win with established liberals, and, traditional Conservatives are the only segment they win, convincingly. Labour has, is in the sort of 30s and 40s across a number of different groups, across 5 of the different groups there. And then you get Reform building support with rooted patriots, traditional Conservatives, but only winning dissenting disruptors. And I guess what I would say is that since the election, if you fast forward to today, those trends have accelerated. So Reform is now massively ahead with dissenting disruptors, but also winning those slightly more risk-averse rooted patriots, has now overtaken the Conservatives narrowly amongst traditional Conservatives, which shows you just how bad the plight of the Conservatives is, winning sceptical scrollers. And then on the other segment, you've got Labour dropping off even more with progressive activists to the extent that they're almost tied with the Greens. You know, that this was a group who gave them, landslide 2019. And then, dropping the incrementalist left, really dropping back with rooted patriots. The only group where Labour have stayed static, and actually perhaps marginally improved, is established Liberals. That kind of slightly more technocratic group who satisfies the group, quite like Keir Starmer, no truck for reform. They're actually doing better there. So that just shows you how those those groups have shifted. Labour has basically gone from being a progressive activist-dominated party to a much wider one, although retracted since, and the incrementalist left and established Liberals are now their base. The Tories pushed down to their very core, and Reform really making gains amongst those right-leaning segments.
So did you say that Labour didn't get above 50% with any of the 7 segments?
Yes, exactly.
Gosh, that's a really clear articulation of that broad but shallow, and it's amazing. You're talking about the sort of more small C Conservatives, getting 60% of the Conservatives getting 60% of audience. You just go, okay, well, yeah, they've got a depth of support there. That is amazing.
Yeah, no, it is a real, and the fact is that the Conservatives were, if you look at it the other way around, what proportion of their vote do the different groups make up? Traditional Conservatives made up 24% of the Conservatives' vote in 2024, despite only being 8% of the population. Right, they became really reliant on that group. Reform, 45% of their vote was that dissenting disruptor vote, which shows you the sort of, the anti-status quo vote really benefiting them. And Labour actually, the plate is quite balanced. They were 28% of their vote is incrementalist left, 21% progressive activist, 16% rooted patriot, 9% established Liberal. They've got a balanced plate, but it is retracted somewhat since. I don't know if a plate can retract, but yeah.
Have you mapped your segments onto the political map, as in onto a constituency map? And so, and you've done it geographically, and so you're nodding there, and so because obviously that makes a big difference about where which voters you're gonna select to go after. And if you're advising, let's say, the Labour Party, which of these 7 segments should they be focusing on?
Well, and it's sort of it's an interesting question, because what we also don't really know, and this might sound like a cop-out, but actually is quite an important caveat, is it sort of depends who their opponents are. Because I guess my classic advice would have been, one of the things that let Corbyn down was not just that he was overly reliant on progressive activists, it's that progressive activists are concentrated by and large in university towns and big cities. Labour win with huge majorities there, so actually they can afford to lose some, and you saw that in 2024 when they did lose some of those voters. But now, of course, they've got your party and Polanski, who actually can compete for those seats. So that is a challenge. I mean, I don't think there's any getting away from the fact that the rooted patriots really do have an outsized role, because they represent they overrepresented in so many of those coastal seats around the country, but also former industrial areas of the UK. I think. And here is an interesting, I think paradox is the wrong word. Here's an interesting mistake that I think is often made in our politics. I think at the moment too many people are merging the rooted patriots and the dissenting disruptors together. I think reform activists make a mistake, but I also think I'm assuming they're all the same. There's kind of broad anti-migration, skeptical of multiculturalism group. And yes, they do agree with those things, but rooted patriots are much more likely to say, to express anxiety about radical change, much more skeptical about figures like Trump, also much more likely to think we should place a premium on tackling offensive speech rather than defending free speech. They are, I think, for Labour and to some degree the Tories, much more reachable than the dissenting disruptors who, 20% of the population, a big group, but their views they're so anti-system now and so much more radical in their demands for change that I think it would be harder to reach that group. So, I think Labour needs to shore up, clearly, its progressive flank, reassure the incrementalist left, but also make sure they're reaching those rooted patriots. I think for Reform, the job is almost the flip. They've got dissenting disruptors, but the challenge for them is a lot of what dissenting disruptors like puts off rooted patriots because it's too risky, it goes too far, but it also puts off traditional conservatives who might again say, yeah, I'm skeptical about net zero and climate change, I'm worried about migration, but I love our institutions and I don't want to tear them all down. And so there's a sort of balancing act there for Reform to play.
So what I'm hearing is it's going to be really not straightforward for Reform to go from wherever they are now, sort of 30% upwards, and similarly, grouping together lots of these segments seems harder than it seems more difficult than when you look at other ways of potentially segmenting it, because you realize actually, by satisfying one group, you're really not doing what the other group wants.
Yeah, and look, I should say, and of course we are more in common. There are lots of areas of common ground, and a focus on the cost of living, the NHS, to some degree, aside from progressive activists, migration appeals across the different groups. But yeah, I think what you've said about Reform is really interesting because, even looking at their 2024 voters compared to their new supporters, big differences, on like much less likely to approve of Trump, Tommy Robinson, Elon Musk, much more pro-Ukraine, much less likely to, think politicians should associate with Lucy Connolly, for instance. There's some big choices from it. And again, using the segments, if you look at Reform's base, as I say, 2024, 45% dissenting disruptor, 24% rooted patriots, 12% traditional conservatives. They're new at 30%. Dissenting disruptors are now just a third of their group. Rooted patriots up to nearly 3 in 10. Traditional conservatives up to 16%. So, holding together this, and I guess, we say, these segments might look more difficult to glue together than other ways of looking at it. But actually, if you think about the challenge of 2019, 2024, and maybe now Reform's challenge, it's, winning in the UK requires appealing to quite diverse constituencies and bringing them together, and doesn't necessarily make for stable coalitions in the past. In the era of two-party politics, that was easier because you had, you kind of glued together because you had nowhere to go. In the era of fragmentation, or, the sort of Netflixification of politics, people have more options for where they go next. And that's why I think it becomes harder.
Yeah. And I guess as a sort of final thought, your point about more in common, I think being able to find the things that do glue these segments together and being pretty laser focused on that is potentially another thing. You can get really drawn into the things that make the segments different, but as you say, trying to focus on the issues at where you can bring people together, the better. Yeah, I think that's interesting. So,
and you can, right? There is a I think delivery is part of it. I think some of the work that we've done, and listeners can find on our website with UCL Policy Lab on the politics of respect, and this idea that we respect contribution, I think spans across the different groups, but it requires, I think sometimes people see our segmentation and say, "Oh, I must have 7 different messages," and I'm like, well, I mean, you all know this, right? You're the expert in it. Like, please don't do that because it doesn't work. It's about finding what resonates across those different groups and remembering that they come, we describe it in the report as, rather than being on a line, these groups come together as almost like a kaleidoscope. So on one question, on migration, you might get the progressive activists and the established liberals together, ask about, tax, and the established liberals move way away from the progressive activists, and actually the rooted patriots and progressive activists want a more redistributive economy. So there are, the more positive side is there are different combinations that work rather than just one linear spectrum.
That's fascinating. And this whole conversation has been brilliant. And I think that's a wonderful note to end on. So, Luke, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I would really recommend all listeners going and having a proper read of the report, and maybe even take the segment test and hit us up in the comments which segment you fall into. Luke, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.